When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." Please join me in the congregational response to our sacred story. This is the sacred story of God and God's people. May the still-speaking God speak to us this day. Thanks be to God.
Thanks, Jim. So the genesis of this sermon series began while I was hiking on the trails in Balboa Park. I was walking with my dogs in the trails in Balboa Park, and I was listening to a podcast of Prairie Home Companions News from Lake Wobegon. And in this particular podcast of the News from Lake Wobegon, Pastor Liz had returned to Lake Wobegon after her sabbatical in Rome, and everyone was excited that Pastor Liz had come home. They did not like the interim minister very much. And Garrison Keillor shares that the sermon that week was a little different at the Lutheran Church in Lake Wobegon because Pastor Liz did something that she had never been known to do before. She changed the sermon midway through. The gospel reading for last week, according to Garrison Keillor, was this very story of Mary and Martha. And Mary and Martha losing their brother Lazarus. And the story just hit a little too close to home for Pastor Liz. Because she, as she had returned from Rome, had just lost a brother herself. And she was afraid that if she preached on that gospel, that she, in the middle of her sermon, would break down and cry. And that just wouldn't go over well at the Lutheran Church. That's not a very Lutheran thing to do, to break down in the middle of your sermon crying. These are people from Lake Wobegon. They're not that comfortable with emotion. So she changed the sermon midway through. And when I heard that podcast, when I heard that story by Garrison Keillor in the News from Lake Wobegon, I said, I have to use this story of Mary and Martha. How can I come up with a sermon series that would allow me to use this story of Mary and Martha where it's nowhere near the lectionary? And I decided a sermon series on women. And I'll place them right in the middle of it. So this is how this sermon series was born. Now, I've had the pleasure and the privilege of presiding at over 100 funerals now in the 15 years that I have been a professional ordained minister. I have presided at funerals and memorial services, celebrations and lives and graveside services at churches and chapels, at gravesides, on top of mountains, on the beach, out in the ocean, in mausoleums, in people's backyards, in front of a wall. I have done funerals for people who have lived long lives and have died of natural causes, and of young children who have died way too soon. I have done funerals for a young man who was pitching. And after throwing the pitch, the ball came back at him so quickly that he couldn't get out of the way. And the ball struck him in the head. I've done the funeral of a young soldier who died from a roadside explosion in Iraq. I've done funerals for people who have died of cancer, AIDS, from complications of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. I've done the funerals and the memorial services of people whose lives have been cut short accidentally due to an overdose and on purpose because they committed suicide. All of these things wrapped up together, I've learned one thing. As I've worked as a chaplain for hospice and as a chaplain for emergency response personnel, I've held the hand of a person as they slowly and gently passed into that life beyond life. I've had to tell a mother that her son died tragically in an automobile collision. I've had to explain to a 5-year-old why their Sunday school teacher won't be here next week. And through all of this, I've learned one thing that I think is common among almost everyone, and that is that they are much like Mary and Martha. And if they had the opportunity to beg and plead with Jesus, they would do so to ask Jesus to give them just one more moment, one more opportunity, one more day with their loved one, with their friend, with their spouse, their husband, their wife, their partner, their son, their daughter, their neighbor, their colleague, their friend, their mother, their father, their grandmother, their grandfather. If they had the chance to plead with Jesus, they would ask him to give them just one more moment. Chapter 11 is dedicated to the story of Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus. Now, other way around. Nazareth and Bethany are not anywhere near each other. They are some great distance, particularly if you are walking by foot. And yet, and I have nothing to base this on, this is pure conjecture on my part, but I have this feeling that due to the emotions that are found in this story, that somehow, some way, Mary and Martha and Lazarus are deep, long, lifelong friends with Jesus. Because the way that they communicate with each other expresses a friendship that goes way back. The type of friendship where if you don't talk to somebody for 6 to 8 months and then all of a sudden you bump into them or you make a phone call, your conversation picks up right where it left off. You know that type of friend. That's what I sense out of Mary and Martha, Lazarus, and Jesus. Because the emotions of this story reflect a deep knowledge of each other. And the way that Martha indicts Jesus is the type of indictment that only a friend can tell you without you getting offended. It is a deep, deep friendship that seems to be existing here in this story, and it's not that common in the rest of the Gospels. You don't ever hear the disciples rebuking Jesus like this. But Martha does, and she gets away with it, and she spurs Jesus to action. Lazarus has been ill for some time. His sisters know this. And so they send this message to Jesus, please come, please get here. But he delays. He says for a good reason, but he delays. But from the perspective of the sisters and of Lazarus, his delay is fatal. And when the disciples hear that Lazarus is dead, they use a euphemism that I think many of us have used ourselves. He's asleep. It's a euphemism. It's a metaphor that we're all very familiar with, to sleep, to die, which echoes, I think, for me, as it might for you, the great quote from Prince Hamlet himself in one of his soliloquies, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. It's a metaphor that we use with the young and with the uncomfortable. He went to sleep. But death is real. And it's harsh for those of us who experience it, those of us who are left behind. And no resuscitation of Lazarus from the dead should sentimentalize or simplify that truth and that harshness. So when Jesus finally arrives on the scene, the pure emotions of the events of Lazarus' passing causes him to become, according to the gospel, aggrieved. A literal wooden translation from the Greek into the English says that he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. These are the verbs that are also tied to the waters being stirred up. And it echoes that this is happening inside of Jesus' own spirit. It can be like the physical stirring of the waters, of disturbing of the calmness of a still lake, and it signifies the emotional and the internal disturbance that is akin to almost being, according to the Gospels, like being physically sickened and disturbed. This is what Jesus feels when Lazarus dies. That's the type of things we feel when someone we deeply love and know and cherish is no longer with us. He is deeply moved by his friend's death. But he is spurred into action by a sister's plea. Lord, Martha says, if you had been here, my brother would not be dead. What an indictment. What a charge by Martha. Where were you? And how many of us have also cried out to God with similar words? Oh God, if you just loved us, then fill in the blank of the name of a loved one who has passed, then they would not have been let to die. Jesus can observe the weeping of Martha. He can hear Mary crying in the house. He can see the professional mourners and grievers who have arrived, who are coming out of the house to be with them. And this mourning and this grief is palpable to him. And this deeply moves him and disturbs him, and he cries, the gospel says. He cries real tears. It is one of the most true and visceral stories in all of the gospels. Jesus is moved by their grief, and he is moved by the loss of his friend. He is angry at this loss, and he's groaning deeply in his spirit. And he is stirred up in emotion, his heart, his mind, his body, by Lazarus' death, and he cries out. For even the incarnate God is broken in his heart and soul by the death of a close friend. Death grieves God as it shakes our heart and breaks our souls. Death is harsh. And it is real. And death stings. It hurts. And no cute answers or metaphors or euphemisms can remove this from us. It is part of the human condition. So what can we say in the midst of the suffering and reality and brutality of death? Is it enough to toll bells and to read names and to remember? Well, according to our sisters Mary and Martha, no, there's more that we can do. Like them, we can proclaim the truth of the sting of death. We can openly acknowledge that it hurts. We can be angry about the grief and acknowledge it that might be inside of us, those of us who have been left after those who have departed have gone away. We can state the brutality of death even if it is just a disturbing fact. Like Martha, we can be angry at God. Like Mary, we can be aggrieved with palpable tears. And like Jesus, we can have an agitated spirit. No matter if it's a death that happened after a long illness and a good long life, or whether it's a death after a sudden and tragic event. Regardless, the gospel truth reigns. Jesus is reported to saying in John with the resounding gospel, this proclamation that I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, they will live. We have things that we hope in that are not of this world. We believe in the power of the cross and the resurrection of the children of God. When I learned of my grandfather's death, I did not handle it well. Initially, when I got that phone call from my mom and dad saying they would be there tomorrow to pick me up, I went out that night, 21 years old, and I got raging drunk. And I cried, and I cried, and I cried. 21 years old, it was the first time anyone in my life had died. Death was brutal, and I was in pain, and the alcohol was supposed to help me numb that pain. When my parents picked me up the next morning, I was dehydrated from the tears that I cried and the alcohol that I drank, and my parents were not happy that I reeked of alcohol. I cried because at that moment, when I was told that my grandfather had passed away, I believed at 21 years of age that I would never see him again. I believed that as he breathed his last, that we would be separated forever, that he would be lost to me. But that hasn't been true at all. Every time that I hear or watch a John Wayne movie, I can see my grandfather. Every time I can see the top of my ketchup bottle is pretty dirty, I can hear his rebuke. Every time I go back to Dallas and I go visit my grandmother, I can see the stool that he sat on that's still in the exact same place in the kitchen next to the counter. And I can physically see his presence there, flexing his muscle and curling his lip. I can see him and I can feel him, and he has never once left me in my life. It's like what the poet Philip Larkin says as he closes his poem, The Arundel Tomb, "What will survive us is love." My grandfather continues to live with me after nearly 20 years since he breathed his last. And I would imagine that you have someone in your life that you feel the exact same way. The Moonlight Sonata is not an ode to the beauty of the moon. And it's really only one of the few of a handful of compositions that Beethoven wrote without being commissioned first. No, the Moonlight Sonata was written as an act of love. Ludwig von Beethoven wrote it after the death of a close friend, a pupil of his, Countess Giulietta Giugardi. And in his melancholy over the loss of this dear friend of his, he wrote this piece, one of his briefest compositions. In the midst of his melancholy and his grief and his mourning, he could still feel his friend's presence in his life. He could still feel her spirit. He missed her. He missed his friend's physical presence, but he had to admit that there was something powerful about her spirit that lingered in his own life. And he compared that spirit to the moonlight. It was a faint light that filled his darkness. Like the moon that radiates in the dark of night, but does not completely fill the space like the sun, the afterglow of a loved one in our life is akin to the moonlight. It shines, but not as brightly as someone's physical presence. Their memory is aglow. It shines, but not in the same way. After I preached this sermon at the 8:30 service, one of our members came up to me and said after her father died, she noticed that evening that there was a full moon. And since that day, Anytime someone that she has loved and she has known has died, she sends them to the moon, she says. The moonlight is a projection of their everlasting spirit, radiating into this realm from beyond paradise. Or as the poet Jean Norhaus would say, for those who say that the dead have no more truck of us are wrong. The dead are all around us, feathering the air with their wings. They see in the fertile darkness that surrounds the sack of light, and in these hours we call them back to steady us, who live in time. If we ever did not know that, we have our sisters Mary and Martha to thank. They pleaded with Jesus, just as we will, just as we do. Their plea moved Jesus to act on their behalf, and Christ will act on our behalf and respond to our grief in our time. There is grace in every single tear. There is grace in every single cherished memory, in every irreverent story we tell, and in the afterglow of those who have moved on before us. Thanks to our sisters, Mary and Martha, we know the gospel promise that we proclaim this day, that I am the resurrection and the life. And those, though they die, they will live. Thank you, Mary and Martha, for your plea. Thank you for reminding us that our loved ones shine on like the moon, guiding us each and every day of our life. That is their plea, and that is the gospel promise we proclaim.